Last time we spoke about Black Saturday and Operation Iron Fist. Conflict erupted in Shanghai on August the 13th when Japanese Marines disguised as civilians provoked Chinese guards, resulting in fierce gunfire and urban combat. Both sides engaged in skirmishes around vital locations, with the 8-character bridge becoming a focal point. On August the 14th, air raids misfired catastrophically, killing over 1,000 civilians in what became known as Black Saturday. In an attempt to regain control, Chiang Kai-shek authorized Operation Iron Fist, a bold offensive targeting Japanese strongholds. The attack commenced on August the 17th, involving coordinated assaults aimed at exploiting weak points in the enemy defenses. However, poor coordination, entrenched opposition, and the complexity of urban combat resulted in further devastating losses for the Chinese troops. By August 18th, Operation Iron Fist had failed, with the Japanese reinforcing their positions and announcing a strategic shift towards expanding military engagement. This episode is The Battle of Shanghai Part 3, the Chinese Counteroffensive, Drive Them Back into the Sea. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. If after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, about 26 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. On August 18th, the Japanese military reinforced their presence in Shanghai, shipping an additional 1,400 Marines from Manchuria to bolster the ranks of the Japanese Shanghai Special Naval Landing Force, or the SNLF. And yes, all of you who might not listen to my Pacific War week-by-week podcast are going to get a lot of acronym lessons soon. And yes, they are not quote-unquote real Marines, but like most telling these similar stories, it's easier to refer to them in that way. This influx of troops was a significant escalation in the ongoing conflict, heightening tensions as the battle for control intensified. As the battle in Shanghai raged on, a growing sentiment emerged amongst the Chinese leaders that crucial chances had been squandered. On August 18th, Chiang Kai-shek sent his trusted aide, Deputy War Minister Chen Cheng, to confer with General Jiang Foukui on the front lines. They assessed the situation and they agreed that instead of attacking the heavily fortified Hongpu area, they should instead redirect their focus to the Hongpu district. The aim was to breach the defenses and split the Japanese forces along the Hongpu River. This strategic shift was precisely what the German military advisors and the frontline commanders had anticipated, signaling a decisive move away from their earlier hesitancy to engage within the settlement boundaries. As attrition was taking its toll on the Chinese troops already committed in Shanghai, the responsibility for the offensive was placed on the newly arrived 36th Infantry Division, a unit highly trained by German forces. They were positioned to advance from the eastern edge of Hankou, with 2 regiments tasked to march south towards the Hongpu. In the early hours of the 19th, 2 regiments of the 36th launched their long-planned attack, moving swiftly towards the front lines. The night was illuminated by the flames of sabotage and incendiary bombs, aiding visibility amidst all of the chaos. However, the assault quickly faced significant challenges. Many of the Chinese soldiers were inexperienced, becoming easy targets for Japanese infantry positioned atop rooftops and in the upper story windows. In the absence of cover, some troops were forced to take shelter behind the fallen bodies of their comrades. For a moment, the Chinese troops felt a surge of hope, believing that they could push the Japanese into the Hongpu River. General Jiang Foukui, observed from the opposite bank, envisioned a breakthrough. However, upon reaching Broadway, parallel to the river, they confronted a formidable barrier. High walls guarded the wharves, and even the largest artillery pieces struggled to breach the defenses. Attempts to scale the steel gate resulted in devastating fire from the entrenched Japanese machine gunners, while fortified factories like the Gongdao cotton mill proved equally impenetrable. As the Chinese forces suffered under relentless bombardment, their momentum diminished. The 88th Division, previously quite effective, showed signs of disarray and hesitancy to engage. Compounding their woes, Japanese reinforcements arrived, swelling their ranks to 6,300 very well-equipped Marines. Now, despite these challenges, the Chinese committed to deploying their newly arrived British-built Vickers tanks, a symbol of their efforts to modernize their military over years. But with each hour, the balance of power tilted further in favor of the Japanese forces. Meanwhile, the 87th Infantry Division was assigned 2 armored companies, yet it suffered catastrophic losses. The tanks recently shipped from Nanjing had crews untrained in coordinated assaults, and many were left without infantry support. The Chinese forces struggled to secure adjacent streets, allowing Japanese armor to outflank and destroy their tanks. The Japanese too faced coordination challenges between their armor and infantry, resulting in some of their tanks being annihilated by Chinese anti-tank weapons. On the 20th, General Jiang Foukui inspected the Hongpu front and encountered a former student leading a tank company ready to attack the wharves. The tanks, hastily repaired and ill-equipped for battle, faced fierce enemy fire, and the young officer expressed concerns about the infantry's ability to keep pace. Despite Jiang's insistence that the assault must proceed, the attack ended in complete disaster, as the tank company was decimated by shells fired from the anchored vessels. The battle blended modern warfare with tactics reminiscent of earlier centuries. An officer named Wu Yujin managed a position during a Japanese cavalry attack on the 18th. After 2 unsuccessful assaults, Wu set an ambush that resulted in the annihilation of the Japanese riders. This incident illustrated the stark contrast on the battlefield, where Chinese soldiers often confronted a technologically superior enemy while grappling with their own inexperience. Brigade Commander Fang Jing of the 90th Division observed that his troops constructed inadequate fortifications that would crumble under the Japanese 150mm howitzers. He would often lament, "Often the positions they built were too weak and couldn't withstand the enemy's artillery." On the 20th, 5 Chinese aircraft returned after yet another unsuccessful attack on the Japanese battleship Izumo, which remained anchored in the Hongpu River. During their flight over western Jai Bay, they encountered 2 Japanese seaplanes. One Chinese pilot broke formation, diving steeply to fire brief machine gun salvos, but his plane was quickly shot down, bursting into flames before crashing. The Chinese attacks had posed a significant threat to the Japanese bombers, particularly the vulnerable Mitsubishi G3M medium aircraft targeting Shanghai and central China. Japan's 1st Combined Air Group suffered heavy losses, with half of its medium attack planes damaged or destroyed within the first 3 days of fighting. However, the Chinese pilots, largely inexperienced and inadequately trained, began to falter against the superior Japanese fighters, eventually withdrawing from the skies over Shanghai. Ground troops expressed frustration over the lack of effective air support, as they rarely saw their planes after the 20th, instead carrying out major troop movements only under the cover of darkness. The Japanese air superiority drastically affected operations on the ground, dictating when Chinese soldiers could eat and transport supplies. Without effective fighter protection and limited anti-aircraft capabilities, the Chinese troops were left completely exposed. Most of their anti-aircraft weaponry consisted of 20mm Solothurn guns, and they were quite ineffective against aircraft, most often used against infantry instead. Officers hesitated to use these guns for fear of revealing their positions to the enemy. By the morning of the 21st, the 36th Division had been relentlessly attacking the wharf area for over 48 hours, yet victory remained elusive. Although some tanks had infiltrated the wharf, they were met with dishearteningly strong Japanese defenses and well-manned enemy presence. The commanders recognized that they had advanced far too quickly without securing their flanks, and their reserves, which could have provided crucial support, remained in the rear. Reluctantly, they concluded that a withdrawal was necessary. The retreat was a painful acknowledgement that pushing the Japanese into the Hongpu River would not be as straightforward as hoped. Part of the Chinese failure stemmed from an inability to execute joint operations across different military branches. German advisors noted that artillery support for the forces in the Yangtze region from the Pudong side were limited. In contrast, Japanese naval guns were actively providing support, significantly relieving the pressure on their Marines. This imbalance resulted in heavy losses for the Chinese, with the 36th Division suffering over 2,000 casualties by late 22nd. Meanwhile, Japanese naval aircraft attempted to impede the movement of additional Chinese troops to Shanghai by bombing the railway from Suzhou. Although several bridges were destroyed and the railway station sustained heavy damage, the delays were minimal, offering some reassurances to Chinese commanders who understood that reinforcements were essential for a successful continuation of the battle. The light cruiser Jinsu, carrying the 3rd Division, set to land 6 miles north of Shanghai, while the 11th Division would disembark a dozen miles further up the Yangtze River. By the evening of the 21st, the task force arrived at the Yangtze River and the Saddle Islands off the river estuary. The soldiers had to transfer to smaller vessels capable of navigating these small waters of the Hongpu River afterwards. On the 23rd, Matsue Iwani got aboard the light cruiser Yura, and he was greeted by Rear Admiral Choichi Nagumo, then the commander of the 8th Cruiser Division. Yes, the same man who would be blamed for losing at the Battle of Midway in 1942. The Japanese fleet had made a strategic sweep as far south as Hangzhou Bay. On the previous day, they disrupted Chinese troop movements to force them to spread thinly across the coast. However, with the landings imminent, it was clear that the assault would happen at Wusong and Chuanshakou. Initially, Matsue preferred landing both divisions at Changshakou for a sweeping advance into the lightly defended countryside west of Shanghai, which he thought would allow them to encircle tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers. The 3rd Fleet, however, proposed a bolder strategy. The 11th Infantry Division would proceed with a landing at Changshakou, while the 3rd Infantry Division would land at Wusong, directly confronting the heavily concentrated Chinese forces around Shanghai. This plan aimed to exert pressure from both the front and the rear, a tactic that could yield success but risked high casualties if faced with stiff resistance. Aware of the operational risks, the naval officers sought to ease potential tensions with their army counterparts by offering over 500 elite Marines to support the assault, preparing for what could be a pivotal moment in the campaign. Shortly after midnight on the 23rd, the Marines, designated as the primary assault wave at Wusong, arrived on a convoy of steamers from Shanghai. Their arrival was eagerly anticipated as they would spare the 3rd Division from being the first to land. As the naval artillery barrage reached a deafening climax, the boats glided across the smooth water towards the shore. Anytime a Chinese machine gun would open fire, it drew immediate responses from the Japanese gunners, swiftly silencing the threat. Meanwhile, trench mortars on shore targeted the advancing vessels, but their rounds fell harmlessly into the water without causing any damage. At 3 a.m., the first landing craft reached the bank, dropped anchor, and lowered its ramp. The Marines waded ashore, climbing the 15-foot-high dike to survey the terrain. Suddenly, machine gun fire erupted from a Chinese position just 50 yards away, cutting down several Marines. Undeterred, the Marines charged with fixed bayonets across the open field. An explosion marked the spot where a soldier had triggered a landmine, followed by even more detonations. But there was no retreat. They pressed on, swarming over the Chinese trench and engaging in a brief yet fierce hand-to-hand struggle. Within moments, they had taken the position. The Marines quickly cleared the area, paving a path to their immediate objective, a military road running parallel to the Hongpu River. While setting up defensive positions, the 3rd Division began to disembark at the water's edge. By 8 a.m., the divisional command stepped ashore as the last unit to arrive. Meanwhile, naval pilots were busy bombing and strafing roads further inland to impede on enemy reinforcements. The landing had unfolded with remarkable success, marking a significant moment in the operation and setting the stage for greater advances by the Japanese forces. Meanwhile, the 11th Division began setting foot on the beach north of Changshakou at about 3:50 a.m. As the soldiers advanced towards the town's outskirts, they encountered only minimal resistance at Chuanshakou, which was defended by only a single Chinese company. Matsue was pleased with the outcome. Everything had unfolded according to plan, and in fact, better than he had dared to hope. Casualties in both divisions were surprisingly low, amounting to little more than 40 soldiers. By 5:30 a.m., Jiang Zhejiang received an urgent phone call at his new headquarters in the small village near Nanxiang. On the line was one Liu Huding, commander of the 56th Infantry Division, reporting that an enemy force of unknown size had landed near Chuanshakou. With heavy bombardment disrupting communications, details were quite scarce, but Jiang immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. A new front was opening, complicating his command significantly. Realizing he could not effectively manage the situation from Nanxiang, with communications being down, Jiang decided to head to the command post of the 87th Infantry Division in Jiangwan, a town closer to the landing area. However, by the time he arrived at the 87th Division's base, it was nearly 9 a.m. He was informed that the Japanese had not only landed at Chuanshakou, but also at Wusong. Recognizing the urgency, he quickly dispatched half of the 87th Infantry Division and a regiment from the recently arrived Training Brigade, which was an elite unit fresh from Nanjing, to respond to the threat. Given that the 56th Infantry Division alone could not secure the area around Changshakou, Jiang assigned the 98th Infantry Division to defend most of the Yangtze River bank under threat. He also dispatched the 11th Division, which had just arrived in Shanghai, with Deputy War Minister Chen Cheng to move towards Luotian, a town just a few miles from the landing zone at Changshakou. Meanwhile, the Japanese forces were advancing quite swiftly. While the main landing contingent engaged in fierce fighting for control of Changshakou, a small unit of a few hundred soldiers was dispatched near the road to Luotian. Marching under the scorching August sun, the reservists, weary from their trek, found little resistance upon reaching Luotian. They hastily set up a camp without adequately preparing defenses, making them quite vulnerable to attack. Later that afternoon, advanced units of the 11th Division reached Luotian, shaken but determined to attack even after facing some pretty heavy air raids. The ensuing skirmish was quite swift. Within an hour, the Japanese were repelled. Back over at Wusang, Hu Guobing received orders to push back the Japanese on August 21st. He led his regiment towards the Japanese lines as his platoons dispersed further, dividing into smaller squadrons. Soon the sharp crack and rattle of small arms fire resonated along the regiment's front. Battalion commander Qin Shiquan, a graduate of the Central Military Academy, led 2 companies towards the enemy positions, taking care to remain unnoticed. When they drew close enough, he ordered his bugler to sound the charge. Then, raising his Mauser pistol, he turned to face his men and he shouted, "Attack! Attack!" This sudden noise revealed his position, making it quite vulnerable. Japanese observers hidden nearby quickly relayed his coordinates to some warships offshore. Within minutes, shells began to rain down on the unit with alarming accuracy. Amidst the storm of fire unleashed by the Japanese, all semblance of order disintegrated and chaos ensued as each unit fought to survive. Hu Guobing spent most of the day dodging Japanese aircraft that circled overhead, waiting for targets to emerge. As he recalled, "It felt as though the enemy could see everything. It was crucial not to act rashly. Our only real options were to take cover in a hole or hide behind a ridge." The gunfire continued throughout the afternoon. It did not relent until darkness began to fall. Only then could the soldiers breathe a little easier, grab a few bites of their field rations, and quench their parched throats with sips of water from their canteens. Seizing the relative safety of night, they hurried to improve their positions, knowing that once dawn arrived, it would be far too late. A shallow trench or inadequate camouflage could only spell doom. Although it had been Chiang Kai-shek's decision to place Zhang Zhujiang and Feng Yusang in charge of Shanghai, now designated the Third War Zone, he was having regrets. In a telephone conversation with Feng Yusang shortly after the Japanese landings, Chiang Kai-shek emphasized the importance of monitoring the younger frontline commanders. He urged, "Don't hesitate to give them advice." Feng Yusang assured him that he would not hold back. He then recounted an anecdote about General Nogi Manosuke, who during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 allegedly delegated all major decisions to his chief of staff. Feng Yusang told him, "The frontline commanders possesses courage and a fighting spirit. Their role is to take orders and engage in battle. Mine is to stay back like Nogi, write a few poems, and wait for the inevitable." Chiang Kai-shek persistently insisted, "Regardless of the situation, don't be shy. Share your insights with them." To this, Feng Yusang said, "Of course. If I notice something amiss, I'll address it without hesitation. You can count on me." However, this assurance did little to calm Chiang Kai-shek's concerns. An even greater concern was Zhang Zhujiang. Much of his rhetoric about fighting the Japanese seemed to lack substance. Zhang Zhujiang had not demonstrated the necessary resolve to launch attacks against the small Japanese forces in the city with decisive action that could have turned the tide of battle. With Japanese reinforcements firmly entrenched in 2 locations within the greater Shanghai area, it was now far too late to pursue a quick victory over the enemy. Compounding the issue, Zhang Zhujiang appeared to spend an excessive amount of time making grandiose statements to newspapers rather than focusing on the ground situation. Chiang Kai-shek's frustration was palpable, and it was shared by his German advisors who concurred that Zhang Zhujiang lacked the requisite toughness to confront Japanese resistance effectively. The decision to send Deputy War Minister Chen Cheng to the front lines was an early indication that Chiang Kai-shek was considering replacing Zhang Zhujiang. In a particularly humiliating twist, Zhang Zhujiang had not even been informed of Chen Cheng's appointment and learned about it indirectly through other field commanders. Fearing that he was being sidelined, Jiang Tuzheng hurried to the Third War Zone headquarters in Suzhou to assess the situation. While in Suzhou, he called upon Chiang Kai-shek, whom began harshly criticizing him for being so far behind the front lines. "What are you doing in Suzhou? What are you doing in Suzhou?" Jiang Tuzheng replied, "Mr. Chairman, I'm back in Suzhou to discuss important strategic matters. Otherwise, I'm constantly at the front. What's the matter with you?" Chiang Kai-shek was incensed by this perceived disrespect. "What's the matter with me? You're asking me, what's the matter with me?" His voice rising to a hoarse shriek, Chiang Kai-shek abruptly hung up. At this point, Jiang Tuzheng had little doubt that his days as a field commander were quite numbered. The Japanese landings had accomplished their immediate objective of relieving pressure on the small marine forces holed up in Shanghai. As a result, the Chinese were forced to halt their attacks on Hongpu and Yangshipu, and they had to reconsider how to allocate their resources across various fronts now. If the Japanese landing party grew any larger, the Chinese forces could risk becoming the target of a Japanese pincer movement. In essence, within a few days, they had shifted from an offensive posture to a defensive one. Against this backdrop, Chen Cheng, leading the 15th Army Group, arrived in Suzhou on August 24th. His presence aimed to bolster resistance, and he was also there to familiarize himself with local conditions, as he was expected to take on a greater role at the front shortly. Chen's confident demeanor and readiness to overrule local commanders indicated that real authority already resided within him. While he agreed with Jiang Tuzheng's plans from the previous day to counter the landings, he deemed them insufficient given the threat posed by the fresh Japanese troops. Consequently, he ordered that more soldiers be redeployed from Shanghai proper to the landing zones. To counter the dire situation, Falkenhausen devised a plan aimed at reigniting enthusiasm for the offensive amongst the Chinese forces. During a meeting on the 25th, he proposed rallying all troops in the Liudan area to mount a coordinated attack from all sides against the Japanese landing forces. Emphasizing the German preference for a decisive strike, he aimed to push the invaders back into the Yangtze. The assembled officers expressed their agreement with the plan. However, as dawn broke, the optimism from the night's discussions began to wane. It had been 48 hours since the landings, and the Japanese army had solidified its foothold at Zhuangqiaokou, rapidly approaching a point of strength that would make it nearly impossible to dislodge them. Tanks and artillery were assembled along the river bank, while engineers constructed a pier to facilitate the faster unloading of troops and supplies. They had already established a bridgehead that extended 10 miles in length and reached a depth of 5 miles, initiating the construction of a road heading inland, an evident preparation for a major offensive. In a secret report to Chiang Kai-shek, Falkenhausen outlined the challenging situation as the Japanese consolidated their material advantages. "It should be noted that the enemy's army and navy operate in close coordination. Although their land-based artillery is relatively weak, this is offset by their robust naval artillery and ship-based aircraft. Furthermore, the airfields at Chongming Island contributed to Japan's now complete air superiority as a result of the main operations on our side that should be executed after dark. From late August onwards, most Chinese movements occurred after sunset. Only then could Chinese and Japanese infantry engage on more equal footing, without the overwhelming advantage provided by air support. Night became the great equalizer in the uneven battle for Shanghai. During the day, relentless, active Japanese forces seemed to be everywhere. They deployed rubber boats up small rivers to scout and disrupt. Their observation balloons hovered on the horizon, keeping a vigilant watch on the Chinese and swiftly scrambling aircraft upon detecting any movement. They combined technological superiority with a bravery that bordered on suicidal. When faced with the prospect of capture, many Japanese soldiers preferred death. Following a fierce battle in the vicinity of Liudan, the Chinese retrieved the body of a sergeant major who had committed harakiri, while a gravely injured private was found attempting to slit his own throat with his bayonet. Liudan remained the immediate target for nearly all the Japanese forces in the area, facing the same Chinese units that had driven them out on August 23rd. The Chinese were well entrenched in and around the town, but they lacked the numbers to consider launching offensive operations against the Japanese at Zhuangqiaokou. Instead, their priority was to strengthen their defenses. While waiting for the Japanese to resume the assault, they endured massive and sustained bombardment. Amongst the Chinese officers, there was a growing sense of crisis and a palpable fear that their defensive line would collapse at any moment. From their perspective, the Japanese appeared to be gaining momentum. However, the situation looked quite different from the Japanese invaders' point of view. Japanese casualties began to rise as the Chinese reinforcements sent to Liudan's area started to make an impact. 2 days after the landings, the number of dead and injured from the 11th Division had exceeded 400, and the toll continued to climb. Amongst the casualties was a senior staff officer who was killed moments after stepping off of his landing craft at Chanshaokou, struck down by a Chinese aircraft that had evaded Japanese fighter cover. The death toll escalated so quickly that not all the bodies could be cremated, as was customary for the Japanese. Privates and junior officers were hastily buried instead. For an army that prided itself on honoring its fallen soldiers more than those left alive, this was a significant blow to morale. The 3rd Division faced different challenges in its sector. It was subjected to relentless attacks on the first day of the landing and had to repel 2 further major enemy assaults on the second day. Additionally, it experienced occasional shelling from Chinese artillery located on the Pudong side. The greatest threat, however, came from the division's right flank. North of the landing zone lay Wusang Fortress, which had been guarding the approach to Shanghai since the wars against the British and French forces in the mid-19th century. From their fortifications, Chinese infantry and artillery continuously targeted the Japanese as they disembarked from their boats and advanced inland. They also fired upon small vessels navigating the Hongpu River, delivering supplies to the division. As the 3rd Division expanded its bridgehead in the days following the landing, Wusang Fortress remained a persistent threat, impeding on the buildup of Japanese forces ashore. Compounding the Japanese sense of being encircled, the village of Yinhang to the south was also under Chinese control. This, combined with the steadily increasing number of Chinese defenders in front of the landing zone, created a challenging tactical situation for the Japanese. Although initial casualties had been lighter than the planners had feared, the number of Japanese losses began to rise. By the 25th, the 3rd Division, often referred to as the Lucky Division, reported over 300 accumulated casualties. 2 days later, that number had escalated to 500, the majority of whom were killed in action. On the 28th, the 3rd Division was finally able to capture the village of Yinhang, freeing itself somewhat from the tactical constraints it had faced up to that point. On that same day, following an intense naval bombardment, the 11th Division launched an assault on Liudan. Leading the charge was Wachi Takaji, a 44-year-old regimental commander who surged forward with his sword drawn, personally dispatching several enemies along the way. The Chinese defenders were driven out of their town and they had to flee across the roads inland. By noon, Liudan was firmly under Japanese control. However, August 29th marked a significant triumph for the Chinese diplomacy front, as Chiang Kai-shek signed a non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union. The pact between Nanjing and Moscow laid the political and diplomatic groundwork for Soviet military aid to China, while ensuring that the Soviet Union would not reach an agreement with Japan as long as the hostilities continued. Initially, Chiang Kai-shek had been wary of Soviet intentions, expressing concerns in his diary on August 1st, when the diplomats were preparing the treaty, that he feared the Kremlin might use the agreement to pressure Japan into signing a similar pact with Moscow. However, following the signing, skepticism gave way to optimism. 3 days after announcing the treaty, Chiang Kai-shek confidently predicted in a speech that the Soviet Union would eventually enter the war against Japan. Chiang Kai-shek would not be wrong about that, but it would have to wait until about 1945. Officially, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin had a clear reason to encourage China to engage in a full-scale war with Japan. It would secure Russia's western flank, while he focused on the strategic challenges posed by Europe, now dominated by Adolf Hitler. A conflict with China could drain Japanese resources, thereby reducing the threat from Asia in the long term. Exasperated British diplomats attempted to warn Chiang Kai-shek about what they perceived as a Soviet ruse, advising that the Russians only have their own interests in mind. Nevertheless, this did little to undermine the Chinese leader's belief in the Soviet Union's willingness to help. At a deeper cognitive level, there was a reason why Chiang Kai-shek and his associates clung to the belief that not only Soviet aid, but also direct Soviet participation in the hostilities was imminent. This aligned with their expectations of how a war with Japan would unfold. The Chinese General Staff's War Plan A, drafted in 1937, was based on the premise that a conflict with Japan would soon trigger a larger conflict involving either the Soviet Union or the United States. Thus, the key objective for China was to withstand the superior Japanese forces until relief could arrive from a more powerful ally, whether it be Russian or American. This strategy was not as naive as it might seem. It was based on the understanding that neither Moscow nor Washington would want to see Japanese power grow too strong on the Asian mainland. Now, despite the capture of Liaodan and Yinhang, the Japanese continued to face significant challenges. Their grip on the Shanghai region remained highly precarious, relying on control of two isolated pockets north of Shanghai and a beleaguered garrison within the city. Due to their numerical inferiority, they were under immense pressure from the Chinese forces. The landings at Wusong and Chaoshaikou had initially bolstered the manpower in the Shanghai area by fewer than 8,000 troops, and although reinforcements were gradually arriving, the pace was rather slow. Matsuyewane recognized the need for a more radical increase in troop levels to achieve a decisive outcome. By the end of August, he cabled Tokyo, arguing that to complete the operation successfully, he required a total of 5 divisions, or at a minimum, the release of the 11th Division's Amaya detachment, currently stationed in northeast China, to reunite with the division at Chaoshaikou. The Japanese Imperial Staff and Navy Command responded mostly favorably, agreeing to redirect the detachment to Shanghai alongside several units of the elite Marines. 1 week after the landings, Wusong Fort continued to pose a significant problem for the 3rd Division and the Navy, which was responsible for supplying the division. Chinese artillery fire made anchoring near the landing zone a perilous endeavor, resulting in several naval officers being killed when caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. At times, the shelling was so severe that vessels had to interrupt their operations and retreat to a berth in the middle of the Hongpu River, unloading only part of the supplies. Matsui now planned for the 3rd Division to launch a frontal assault on Wusong, while the 11th Division would maintain a supportive role, dispatching only 1 regiment to assist. The attack commenced at 10 a.m. on August 31st. Following an intensive naval and aerial bombardment involving over 30 planes, a regiment from the 3rd Division boarded landing craft, sailed down the Hongpu River, and landed on the riverbank north of Wusong. Throughout the afternoon into the evening, the soldiers engaged in fierce skirmishes with scattered Chinese units in front of Wusong in preparation for a final entry into the city. Meanwhile, the Asama detachment from the 11th Division initiated its part of the offensive by marching along the banks of the Yangtze towards Shujuling. On the morning of September the 1st, the Japanese tightened their grip on Wusong. The regiment from the 3rd Division seized a hamlet west of Wusong and readied for an assault on the town itself. The defending Chinese forces put up a strong resistance, and it was not until the late afternoon that the Japanese made any significant progress, aided by artillery fire from their ships. The Asama detachment experienced somewhat greater success that day, successfully capturing the fort at Shujiling in the afternoon. The Japanese launched their final offensive against Wusong at dawn on the 2nd. To their surprise, the fort fell with relative ease. By 10 a.m., Matsui saw the rising red sun hoisted over Wusong, and he felt boundless gratification. With the fall of Wusong, the town of Baoshan became the last major obstacle to disrupt Japanese control over the riverbank, stretching from Chaoshaikou to the outskirts of Shanghai. The fort at Baoshan also posed a significant threat to the Japanese naval operations due to its strategic location at the confluence of the Yangtze and Hongpu rivers. Chiang Kai-shek fully recognized the importance of Baoshan, and he ordered a battalion of the 98th Infantry Division to hold the town at all costs. Baoshan had one notable advantage. Like many ancient Chinese towns, it was encircled by a thick city wall that had historically helped fend off invaders and was still serving defensive purposes quite well. The Japanese were acutely aware that Baoshan favored defense, and even a small contingent of Chinese forces could potentially hold out for an extended period of time. On the 4th, the 3rd Division sluggishly advanced towards Baoshan, and around mid-afternoon, an artillery unit arrived to assist in bombarding the city walls. Despite this support, the Japanese soldiers sent in waves to scale the wall, only to suffer significant casualties and fail to penetrate the defenses by nightfall. At noon on September the 5th, Japanese bombers launched an air raid over Baoshan, while naval artillery rained shells indiscriminately over the town's great roofs. The land attack began an hour later when Japanese tanks advanced towards the town gates. The Japanese pressed the Chinese defenders into a shrinking perimeter. By sunset, the defenders were left with only 100 soldiers, and that night passed without incident, as the Japanese refrained from attacking without any air support. But everyone knew that dawn would herald the end. Just as the sun rose above the horizon, the assault resumed. As the city neared its fall, the defending commander, Yao Xinqing, ordered a soldier to escape and report the situation to his superiors. Unnoticed by the Japanese, the soldier scaled a part of the wall and fled into the surrounding countryside, becoming the sole survivor of the battle. He carried with him a message from the battalion. "We are determined to stay at our posts and to continue fighting the enemy until each and every one of us is killed." I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. So please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Despite initial Chinese hopes for a counteroffensive by the newly arrived 36th Division, their inexperience and poor coordination led to heavy losses. As the Japanese gained reinforcements, they executed strategic landings at Changchapko and Wusang, overwhelming the Chinese defenders. Amidst the escalating casualties, Chinese troops struggled to maintain morale. However, their resolve to fight persisted, even as defeat loomed over the besieged city and its defenders.